What hooked me about shorebirds was this very compelling narrative about migration that I actually think shorebird researchers and shorebird conservationists have done a really good job in telling to the world. It's this
Mm.
whole story about you've got this chocolate bar sized bird and they spend their lives chasing the summer, which is something I frequently do as well. They travel tens of thousands of kilometers flapping the whole time, not like raptors, not going on the thermals, but flapping, 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 flapping for tens of thousands of kilometers just to spend these couple of magic weeks on the tundra, far away Arctic tundra, only to be chased back south again, by the coming of winter. And this whole idea that these incredible journeys could be over forever if we don't stop putting up buildings on top of tidal flats. Tidal flats is another interesting part of the story because it's this part of the coast that just looks like endless, useless mud. What would you need it for?
Right.
And there's been, a huge effort to show that mud flats are actually teeming with life and they support not only shorebirds, but thousands of other things. And they protect coastal human communities from storms and so on. So it's just the whole story of shorebird migration, and especially in our region, the perils that shorebirds are facing that are disrupting their migrations. It's just a really compelling story.
Hello, everyone. Thomas here, and welcome back to another episode of the Birding Today podcast. Glad to have you with us. Just a little bit of housekeeping, a little bit of an introduction to the introduction. I'm excited to announce a new giveaway competition, this time in collaboration with Treeswift Wildlife Nature. So the giveaway is a free day out birding with Treeswift Wildlife Nature, customized to you. If you're a bird photographer, they'll help work with you to get spectacular shots of your target species, or if you're a veteran birder, they will help track down those difficult species or add a new tick for your list. Or if you're someone new to the birding world who wants to try out binoculars and scopes, visit new areas, and learn about birding at a more leisurely pace, then they would love to have you too. So that's what's up for grabs, a free day out birding with Treeswift Wildlife Nature. So to enter the competition, the conditions of entry are for you to like both the Birding Today podcast and the Treeswift Wildlife Nature Facebook pages, like last time, and then email me at birdingtoday@gmail.com to tell me what your favorite bird is and why. So I hope to hear from all of you soon with that email. Make sure you like the Treeswift Wildlife Nature Facebook page. I'll put the links in the show notes, and my page as well. And hopefully we can kick off another great competition, another great giveaway. So thank you to Treeswift Wildlife Nature for that, and for reaching out. That was great. And, well, let's jump into the episode. Thanks, everyone. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Birding Today podcast, where birders come together to discuss the joy of birding. I'm your host, Thomas Doerig. Today's guest is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Queensland. Her research focuses on waterbird ecology and wetland conservation, especially of coastal migratory shorebirds. She believes that collaborative partnership building, where people share experiences and learn from one another, is critical to achieving long-lasting conservation outcomes. Like the birds she studies, my guest today migrated across the globe from her home in Canada to Australia, where she is highly nomadic. She has also worked on coastal conservation in Oman, Palau, China, and Singapore, and feels very privileged to spend most of her spare time and income discovering new places and new birds around the world. Amazing. To further the aim of building collaborations across countries, cultures, and languages, today's guest contributes in a volunteer capacity to such initiatives as the East Asian Australasian Flyway Partnership and the emerging World Coastal Forum, and is the current president of the Society for Conservation Biology Oceania. So please welcome Dr. Micha Jackson on the show. How are you doing? Misha, sorry. I'm so sorry. Misha.
No problem. I'm really good. Thank you so much for having me. I'm melting a bit here in Darwin at the moment, but otherwise I'm excellent.
Yeah, well, again, thanks so much for the time, and you know that it's definitely kind of a little bit of a problem, like scheduling these events, and you know about that as well with meetings that you do, and I can imagine. And so let's jump right into the birds then. And the central topic of the show is an interesting one, and it's the whole reason I started the show, is to discuss the joy of birding. So where do you what is it about birding that brings you joy?
Yeah, I think for me, the most joyous aspect of birding is how it has totally changed the way that I experience a new place. I'm sure you can tell that I love traveling. And I think since I've become a birder, I never go somewhere that I've never been before. And I wonder, like, wow, what should I do first? The answer is always, I want to go and see and record local birds, especially birds that I've never seen before. And I think like once I start to have some familiarity with local birds, I feel like I understand something about this one aspect of the environment of a new place that's kind of hidden for many people. So I think it's kind of a way of meeting the world that's really sort of magical and deep. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I can understand that. And in a way, each place is identified by its birds. You know, the
Mm-hmm.
soul of a place. Like when you go to a new place, that's all I think about. When I see something on the TV, or I see a program, or I read a book about a place, it's like, oh, the birds must be great there. That's the first thing I think about. Because that's the driver for us, it's the passion that speaks, and the joy, um, and I think it's really interesting to discuss that, because and even within a country like Australia, like you've been traveling around a little bit lately, like there's totally different birds, wherever you go in Australia, opposite ends of the country, but also relatively, nearby places can have
Yeah.
different birds, and I definitely agree, for sure.
Absolutely. And I think, there's kind of the bird and the environment side of it, but it's also interesting from the people side. Cause I don't know about you, but like I wouldn't ring up a person I found online and be like, hey, do you want to take me to see the Eiffel Tower or show me around the Forbidden City? Like that would just be strange and probably prone to disaster. But I don't have any hesitation at all getting in touch with someone through a local bird club, or even just the person who has the most eBird list from a place, and just asking them, like, do you have any birding tips, or maybe even time to go birding with me? And more often than not, people will say yes. And then you meet them, you meet other birders, and suddenly you have this little local network who tells you their favorite restaurants and the local watering holes that tourists don't know about, and what nightclub to go to, whatever. And so I think that's a really joyful part of it, is that, it helps you navigate the world, both in terms of how you experience it and also in terms of how you meet people in this really fun and interesting way. So
Yes, definitely. And I think you touched on a couple of points there. The one is the trust that birders have, in relation to each other. Like I agree. Like I don't hesitate. Like if I'm in a new place, or even in a place that I'm familiar with, and I see that someone's uploaded an eBird list, and there's a rare bird on there, it's like, oh, you'd get in touch with them straight away. And there's not so much of a barrier in birding as there might be with other, maybe with other hobbies or other activities. And birders, and I think that's because birders are generally trustworthy. That's why, and I think that's a beautiful thing about the social side of things and the people side. And actually, that's another question that comes up on the show a lot, is do you prefer going birding alone, or do you also appreciate going like as a group? Do you have a preference in that regard?
I think when I'm in a new place, I always want to go with a local birder, because I have this massive fear that I'm missing out on something great because I just don't know where it is, or that I might be, trespassing on somewhere that I didn't realize I wasn't supposed to go, or whatever. And it just all that extra nonsense just kind of drops off when you're birding with a local, because you're like, oh, I'm in your hands. You know the place. You know how to talk to the local people. All good.
Mm.
So I think when I'm in a new place, I almost always like going birding with a local. But I have to admit that when I'm on my own, of course, I'm always very happy to take out other birders, especially new birders who might want a hand. But there is something really relaxing and deeply satisfying about birding on your own. And I am kind of a bit of a loner by nature. And like sometimes when I'm really lucky and I get to go birding in really remote places, there might be like 6 of us for hundreds of kilometers, and the first thing I want to do is get away from the other 5 to go birding, not because I don't think they're fantastic, but just because there is there's something that's so difficult about getting away from other people these days. And, birding is a good excuse to just have a little bit of alone time doing something that is really relaxing and joyful. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think I'd also say excuse isn't even the right word. It's a reason, right? It's because
Sure.
we're driven as birders, and I love that about it's when you're in a group in a remote place, like you still want to find that solitude, and in our jobs and in our family lives and our social circles, we're always bound to people in some ways, and maybe that's why birding is so. What would you say? It calls us, right? It calls us to nature, like, and
Yeah.
to be alone. I think that's what happens to me, and that builds up in one's life, doesn't it? And I'm interested in discussing how you got into birding, like, back to your earliest days and when you were interested in nature, maybe. How did you come to get interested in birds?
Yeah, it is a funny one because when I was a kid, I was really interested in birds and really all things outdoorsy. And the thing that really sticks out in my mind is that every year during winter, as many Canadian families do, my family would take a short vacation to Florida to escape the winter. This is a great Canadian tradition, vacationing in Florida around November.
Wow.
And if you look at my photo albums from when I was like sort of 7, 8, 9 years old, I've like meticulously and with great accuracy, I must say, put labels next to all these like film developed photos of roseate spoonbill and red-shouldered hawk and great blue heron. And I must say too, I do remember it joyfully chasing what I can almost guarantee now was sandaling down the beach when I was in Florida, which is something I would strongly discourage people from doing now. In fact, I spend a lot of time in Darwin asking people to please not walk or run or have their dogs too near the birds, but it was something that I took great joy in when I was a little kid. And it's a funny one that you asked me this today because the place that we went is a really special little island called Sanibel, and it was actually recently completely flattened by Hurricane Ian. It's the
Oh.
one everyone's been seeing on the news. So I feel, yeah, this sort of a huge sense of grief, of course, for the residents, but also for the wildlife, because that place has a really special, I guess, spot in my childhood memories. So yeah, that's kind of my earliest memory.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so that's an important part in any birder's life, because that's when you form your birding knowledge and your birding habits, maybe. And it's interesting that that was in Canada for you, because it's a very different place to bird, in relation to Australia, because the avifauna is so different. You get different families, entire different habitats. And so how does the transition to Australia happen? When did you come to Australia first, in that
Yeah.
capacity?
Well, I guess a couple of things there. I mean, the funny thing is because Florida is, I mean, of course, Florida's not in Canada. I don't actually remember that many birds captured. Like the birds I remember from when I was a kid are from Florida, which is like a coastal tropical area, which is like where I live now. So I don't know why I was more attracted to those birds than my home birds, for one thing. But it's funny. I think in high school and in uni, I completely lost that interest. I wasn't interested in
Oh.
kind of naturalism at all, really. I wasn't I didn't like going hiking or anything like that. But by the end of uni, I was really interested in coastal conservation, and that was what actually brought me to Australia originally. And I was very interested in things like marine turtles and dugongs and stuff like that. And when I came to Australia, yeah, I met someone who has been hugely important in my life, who is an absolutely obsessive and really joyful birder. And it really took their love and passion for birding to get me into it as an adult and to kind of rediscover that joy in myself. So yeah, I think that's another one of those great things about birding is that it can be really contagious in the best way.
Yeah, it's. I got really interested, when you were speaking about, the period in your life where you were not as interested, because that's interesting. Because like you started out young and like really interested, and then you had a phase where you weren't so interested. Why do you think that is? Have you looked back on that and thought about why you had a phase where you weren't into birding?
Yeah, for sure. And I don't really know what the answer is. I think, I think a lot of things happen to you when you're a teenager, and they can take you in a lot of different directions and pull you really strongly. So I think it was just one of those things. I think, it was probably always there somewhere. It was just dormant for a while. And yeah, like I said, it was really, I always had this passion for the coast that is definitely linked to like those early memories of Florida. And I would wait and wait and wait for it to be summertime in Canada, and all I wanted to do is get in the lakes there and see. Like I've always been like a water person, always wanted to be on the shoreline of
Mm,
something. So I
mm.
think that was always there. But yeah, I actually remember see, because I got a fellowship to travel after university. That's how I first started looking into coastal conservation. My whole project was about how different cultures approach conservation of the same species, and that's why I went to Oman and Australia and Palau and had a look at those things. But I remember someone else's proposal for the same fellowship, who actually did also receive one in another year, being about migratory birds, and I thought it was really silly. I was like, why would anyone follow these birds around everywhere? And that's like my whole life now. So yeah, I don't know why that is, but yeah, I
Mm.
guess your interests change over your life, and there's lots of things that push and pull you in different directions.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess when you're a teenager, again, going back to that, if there's any teenage birders listening, like, I guess the environment in which teenagers, um, the environment in which they're active, lots of social activity going on, and not all of it positive, especially in that world of education and school, and so it can have a certain stigma maybe, and that's when it can be discouraged among peers maybe. I kind of experienced that a little bit, but yeah, it's different for everyone, and then that also leads on to the persistence that you do have now with your work and your passion, and it's I've written down here while you were talking, different cultures, same species.
Mm.
So I guess to start that discussion off, what do you think brings people together in birding and conservation?
Yeah, I mean, I guess we kind of got into this space already a bit earlier. I think birding is an amazing way that people from different cultures and particularly different age groups, that otherwise have totally different interests, can kind of get together instantly and know they have something in common. And I think you said earlier something about barriers. I think it's interesting because some people I know, where it's even the same person, they can have a lot of barriers if someone tries to talk to them about anything else except birding. But as soon as someone talks to them about birding, all the barriers are gone. And I think that is one of the things, one of the reasons why birding brings people together. People just interact differently when they just suddenly feel that they have something in common with one another, even though they might not otherwise. And I think it's really interesting that you see that on a really local scale. Like there's people in my really local area where I sometimes will be out birding with them and think to myself, this is so funny, because if it wasn't for birding, I can't imagine another reason why the two of us would have got together. But then of course you end up learning other things about their life, and you learn all sorts of stuff, and they might introduce you to someone else and someone else. And that whole kind of chain of interaction wouldn't have been there without birding. But it also happens at these huge scales. If you reach out to someone in another country and ask you to take them birding, it can be, just this huge, instantly all these barriers and all this trepidation that you both might have in approaching one another just sort of fall away. And I think that's kind of specific to birding. I mean, I'm sure there's many other activities, but I think that is one of the really cool things about birding. Yeah.
Well, the reason it's so unique to birding is because birds are everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
That's like the foundational reason why we can build these networks, and I'm really interested in that. Like, you can go from the local, the extremely local, sphere, where you meet a birder who's out, and you can tell they're a birder immediately. You know that moment. It's like,
Yeah.
because they got binoculars or a camera, or they
I
just
see the khakis, you see my khakis. Yeah,
That's right. There's this code, and it's like almost unspoken, but it bonds people together. And I think a lot of people listening to this are familiar with that. But what they're less familiar with is the international way that works. Because so let's shift onto that a little bit, to the international networks that birding can create in the realm of conservation specifically.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, in some ways, it's almost a different thing, that the type of connection you have when you go birding with someone, which I think is very social and quite fun, and then the type of connection you have with someone through conservation. Because I think in the same way that birding connects people that are totally different, I think people who meet each other and come together through conservation sort of share this almost really deep and almost kind of profound connection straight away. And they don't have to be both working in bird conservation, they just have to be working in conservation. And I think that's because, conservation can be tough. You can feel like the whole world is stacked against what you're doing and what you're trying to do, and that even, people who you really love, who are your friends or your family or other people, they just kind of don't get it sometimes. And I think that can lead to feelings of, hopelessness and ecological grief if you feel like these incredible places and species that just bring out so much kind of passion and joy in you are just going to be wiped out, and you just feel like the world's just going to keep rolling along and maybe no one's even going to notice. That can be really hard. And I almost think that conservation brings people together. There's kind of a group therapy aspect to it, I think. Sometimes just listening to other people, even on a podcast or something, people you will never even meet, it just makes you feel better hearing someone else doing these crazy things on behalf of conservation. And you realize that, no, you're not alone. You have this connection to people all over the world who have this same shared sense of wanting to conserve things, of the importance of non-human species and the importance of places that are still wild. And that makes you feel connected to people everywhere. And then when you have the opportunity, like I have, and the incredible privilege to be able to travel, it just kind of gets amplified even more. Like as soon as you meet someone else working in conservation, it just instantly cuts across, those social barriers, language barriers, culture barriers that can be really big and prohibitive in other settings. And it's like, nah, we've got a job to do. We've got work to do. Let's get to it. And I think that's really amazing and really strong.
Thank you for listening to the Birding Today podcast. It's great to have you with us. If you're enjoying the show, don't hesitate to leave a positive review on whichever podcast app you're using at the moment. This really helps with getting the podcast up in search results and reaching more people. Thank you, and back to the show. You touched on the difference between birding and conservation. What is the difference between birding and conservation?
Well, I mean, I think it's entirely possible to go birding just because you find it relaxing, or because you're compulsive about making lists, or because you want to find things, or because you want to get away from your job and clear your mind. And do, like, there's a whole set of reasons you can go birding that have really nothing to do with conservation. I mean, conservation is a whole different thing, where you're thinking about those species in terms of what are the threats they face, what are the potential things that might mean they're not here in another generation or another 2 generations. And I think, some people have a really strong awakening within themselves to try and contribute to things that will help to conserve birds, and some people don't. And I think that's okay.
Yeah, because it can go both ways, right? Or maybe it doesn't. You can tell me, but like birding, the passion and the hobby and the obsession, you could say, of birding can lead to conservation in a person's life, or not even that, but like an ecological awareness of what's going on, and that person's interest in birds has led them along that path. Can the same happen? I'm guessing it can't really, because you've got to have that foundational passion for the creatures that you want to protect first before protecting them. Do people in conservation get into birding or get into... Do you see what I'm trying to say? Like, can it go both ways?
Yeah, I think it totally can. So I think, I definitely know, of course, I know some birders who are absolutely passionate conservationists who've done extraordinary things on behalf of bird conservation. Don't get me wrong. And I think having that deep understanding of ecology and things like that, it makes you approach conservation in a different way. But fundamentally, conservation is about human behavior and human decisions. And equally, I talk to people who've never thought much about birds before, or they just like seeing a kookaburra on their way to work or whatever. And we wouldn't call them a birder, but they can get just as passionate, even more so, about bird conservation. There's people I know who are birders, who work in really environmentally destructive industries, and they don't see any kind of dichotomy between those two things. And, sometimes I do find it baffling when people don't translate necessarily birding to bird conservation, but I think I've really learned to let that go. Like, everyone's different. And I think what's really important is to make sure that we don't alienate people who really have no interest in ever telling the difference between a sharp-tailed sandpiper and a petrel sandpiper. They don't have any interest in standing for 5 hours on a beach and counting 3,000 shorebirds. But when you tell them the story about habitat loss or climate change or invasive species, they can get really passionate about it. And it's super, super important, imperative, I would say, to make sure that people who are not hardcore birders don't feel like they can't participate or can't understand bird conservation, because they absolutely can. I mean, there's very few people who don't have birds speak to them in some way, and it's just not going what we would call going birding for everybody, I don't think. And so I think the key things are really about doing what's going to make the most difference to bird conservation overall, which I think is, one, sure, doing good research and using that research as the basis for advocating for policy change. But number two, building momentum for policy change that's going to benefit conservation by getting people to care about it, by making people aware of these types of issues. And I think that can be through birding, but I don't think it has to be by any means.
Right. Yeah, it's one of the many paths to get there, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And so, let me throw a curveball at you then. What's the fundamental aim of conservation?
Yeah, I mean, you could probably spend a whole 2 hours talking about that. I mean, I don't know that conservation has one fundamental aim other than the idea that we're trying to preserve intact ecosystems and we're trying to make space in the world for all the amazing, diverse, and fantastic creatures that were here long before us, and make sure that we're not the last man standing. Because I mean, not only will that not work fundamentally, but I think the world just becomes a less interesting and a less amazing place, if we lose a species. I think one of the things that's really I hope changing in conservation is this idea that it's not enough just to kind of preserve, have the Noah's Ark of species, 2 of everything left, and then we're doing a good job. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, the sheer loss of numbers, and shorebirds are a good example of this. Some populations, we estimate there's sort of 85% less individuals now than there were a few generations ago. Like, that's not acceptable. That's a huge part of conservation aims. So it's not just about preserving each species, but it's about having functioning ecosystems, having healthy populations of other species that can, do things like amazing migrations that birds do, and can act in the way that's natural. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's probably not a very succinct or good answer, but yeah.
I agree though. Like, it's difficult to articulate, isn't it? It's so innate in us to want to preserve, right? Especially things we're passionate about. And let's move on to your research and your choice of focusing on waterbirds and shorebirds in your career, correct?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. So why did you choose shorebirds specifically?
Yeah, I think what hooked me about shorebirds was this very compelling narrative about migration that I actually think shorebird researchers and shorebird conservationists have done a really good job in telling to the world. It's this whole story about, you've got this chocolate bar sized bird, and they spend their lives chasing the summer, which is something I frequently do as well. They travel tens of thousands of kilometers, flapping the whole time, not like raptors, not going on the thermals, but flapping for tens of thousands of kilometers, just to spend these couple of magic weeks on the tundra, far away Arctic tundra, only to be chased back south again, by the coming of winter. And this whole idea that these incredible journeys could be over forever if we don't stop putting up buildings on top of tidal flats. Tidal flats is another interesting part of the story, because it's this part of the coast that just looks like endless, useless mud. What would you need it for?
Right.
And there's been, a huge effort to show that mud flats are actually teeming with life, and they support not only shorebirds, but thousands of other things, and they protect coastal human communities from storms and so on. So it's just the whole story of shorebird migration, and especially in our region, the perils that shorebirds are facing that are disrupting their migrations. It's just a really compelling story. So to be honest, I think knowing what I do now, I might actually choose to work on a different group of species that we know less about, or that gets less attention. But yeah, I got taken in by this incredible story, and I think shorebirds and I are sort of stuck with each other now.
I mean, I can understand that, and one species popped into my mind that's probably very relevant to this is the spoon-billed sandpiper, right?
Mm-hmm.
That, I haven't read up on that lately. Is that, do you know where those guys are at, the spoon-billed sandpipers? Because I know there's known locations in China, is that right? Mudflats in China where they're regularly seen, or...
Yeah, so the region in China where I did the fieldwork for my PhD is actually one of the most important places in the world for spoon-billed sandpiper, especially during their migration period. So not necessarily during the non-breeding, not during the full non-breeding season, but when they're moving through, when they're traveling through between breeding grounds and non-breeding grounds.
Yeah.
The really, really critical, if you said one site that's the most critical site in the middle for spoonies, is around the region where I did my PhD of fieldwork. And a few years ago, that whole area was earmarked essentially for development, for reclamation. That whole thing, when I first visited those mudflats, there was sort of signs for the reclamation project right there. And you were sort of standing and you're saying, I'm looking at almost the whole population of spoon-billed sandpipers left in the world, and this whole place is meant to go under. And that's now part of the World Heritage area that's already been approved as phase 1 of China's Serial World Heritage Site, which is aimed, very explicitly at conserving the remaining tidal flats that are critically important for migrating waterbirds. So that's something that has gone from really feeling very hopeless to being in a much better situation now than it was a few years ago. There's also been some incredible research about finding where their non-wintering sites are, because those are largely in Bangladesh, in Thailand and Myanmar, and it wasn't very well documented where those places were. And there's been some amazing research really revealing those places, and we need to know where those places are in order to conserve them. So I think the outlook for spoonies is a lot better now than it was even 10 years ago. Yeah,
that's great. And those conservation success stories are always encouraging, and they must be a driver for you to keep going in conservation. So in terms of your particular research, this was a little bullet point that we had prepared, is what are some things your research has uncovered about shorebirds?
Yeah, one of the interesting things, I think it's interesting, I don't know if anyone else does, but one of the things I really tried to illustrate during my PhD was I collaborated with a lot of people from other countries and also throughout Australia, and put together sort of a bunch of different data sets together. And what I did with that research was tried to show how important some actually human production areas are as habitat for shorebirds. So things like aquaculture ponds, rice paddies, even things you wouldn't think of like dredge boil ponds inside ports and wastewater treatment ponds. These are very kind of high use production areas for humans, but especially during that high tide period when tidal flats are covered up by seawater, these are actually really, really important places for shorebirds. And, human production areas from a shorebird's perspective are not equal as far as habitat value. So a shorebird can quite happily get along in a shallow aquaculture pond, for example, at high tide. They might even be able to find lots of food there. But funnily enough, if you have a field full of solar panels, which is increasingly common, there's no habitat for shorebirds there whatsoever. So that's one of those interesting conservation trade-offs. Of course, we want to encourage renewable energy, but we don't necessarily want it to be right next to a really important shorebird feeding site, for example. I guess my research is really about this intersection. Is this kind of like, when the tide's out, shorebirds are out here and humans are over here. And then as the tide comes in, they kind of increasingly overlap. So it was about, in these really highly developed coastal areas, which are common throughout our entire region, how do we make enough space for shorebirds at high tide?
Yeah. So interesting about the solar panel dilemma, isn't it? It's like, what would you rather have, renewable energy or the shorebird's habitat? That's
Hopefully
interesting.
it's not a one or the other trade-off.
Right,
Yeah, but
right.
I think increasingly it's sort of about thinking, yeah, really spatially about where to put things and how to consider biodiversity in a spatial sense when making coastal management decisions. Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah, for sure. And then the whole other part of that, and this was part of your research, I'm sure, is the collaboration, you know, between nations. Birds don't see political borders or geopolitical borders. So like they just, of course they don't. So it's on us to make the necessary uh, networks and maybe sacrifices at times with other organizations in order to facilitate the best outcome for the birds, right? So how is that? Like how do you go about that an international collaboration, because it's a huge enterprise and a lot of times it's, well, I guess mostly it's English based, right?
Hopefully not. Hopefully that's changing. I really hope so. I think that's one of the key things. There's some amazing new kind of research groups and research labs really focused on this issue, specifically in conservation, about overcoming language barriers. And it's certainly something that I've tried to at least make a start considering in my work. So, for example, one thing I worked on as an outcome from my PhD was so we did some research. We found out that these spaces are important for shorebirds. That's great. I publish it in a scientific journal over here. How does the person who manages a fish pond ever get that information, right?
Right.
So I did a big collaboration with, I think it's about 16 or 18 co-authors from all across the flyway. And we worked together to try and express some of the scientific information into a kind of guidebook for managers that was kind of expressed in language that we think anyone could understand and that would kind of be meaningful to them. But we also had an amazing group of translators and got those put into 7 different languages on top of English. So I think that's really important. And I think it's an under-resourced aspect of research. And I think we're missing out on a lot of two-way learning, a lot of data even by not tackling language barriers. So I think we're starting to make progress, but I do think that's one of the really important things we still need to keep working on. Yeah.
And you mentioned, like, how does it get to the people on the ground, you know, the people who are managing and interacting with these biological spaces, these ecosystems. So,
Yeah.
so how does that happen? Does it, because I guess the science.
It goes back to birding with locals. Like, that's the funny thing. And there's actually a really interesting master's project ongoing at the moment that's looking at how do people actually collaborate specifically on bird research in our flyway. And essentially what it's finding is that you can make as many phone calls, do as many conference presentations, or write as many emails as you want. The way that collaboration works in practice is that you go on the ground and you meet the other people, and they know the other people, and they know the other people. And like, it is very much informal networks that end up joining people together, which then form the basis of really solid research collaborations, which then in turn form the basis of good informing policy and getting genuinely collaborative policy done. I
Yeah.
think one point I wanted to make in terms of that, that Shorebirds really, really brought home for me that I'd never thought about much before, is if you imagine shorebirds, moving between somewhere in Siberia and down to New Zealand, and they need, in order to make that journey successfully, they need to stop off a few times on the way. And a lot of times they need to ingest a lot of food to either recover or put on enough fat to make it all the way up at those sites, right? But from a conservation perspective, you can do amazing, best in the world, top shelf conservation in, like, let's say 8 out of the 9 countries that those shorebirds go to. But if you have just this one spot for a particular species that is really important, that's a super aggregation site that a lot of the population goes to, all that effort everywhere else is almost, it's almost unimportant because you have this weak spot in the middle. And so we have to understand how migration works. We have to understand where those pinch points are. And we need each of the places along the way to put in a sort of similar level of conservation and management effort. Otherwise, the effort everywhere else is lessened hugely. And that's one of the reasons we think that some shorebird species have declined so much, because there's just a couple of really critical sites in the middle where they're really kind of threat prone. So I think it just highlights that it's impossible to do conservation effectively in a vacuum for some species, not for every species, but for migratory things like migratory shorebirds, it's 100% necessary to collaborate and have that full understanding, which you just can't get without having people on the ground speaking with each other in each of those places.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Like if you have 10 sites and 8 of them are top notch, but then you've got 2 that are, not suitable for the shorebirds, you'd think that that's 80% of sites which are good.
Yeah, doesn't work like that.
Doesn't it? That's incredible. So why doesn't it work like that? Because
it's kind of, if you think about it, it depends on how much the birds aggregate, right? So some species spread out, and you might have, if you imagine in a very simplified way, if you imagine the world kind of up and down, if you have birds spread out in a line and they all go up and down, then if you conserve 8 across or 8 up and down, it's kind of okay. But a lot of birds actually go to the whole population of the bird. It's like a funnel. So they're spread out up here and they're spread out down here, but then there's a funnel in the middle, and all the birds go into that bottleneck in the middle. And so if those sites are no good, there's no other sites to either side that they can go to instead.
So they can't push on, though. They can't push on to the next good site, one of the 80% of sites that are suitable.
Sure, in theory, they probably will try, but there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the way that they sort of behave and how dependent their physiology is on putting on fat in certain bits of the migration pathway, that there are key regions that are really, really important. And I mean, in some cases, it's not a trivial amount of habitat that's been impacted in the middle, right? It's like a whole region has had a huge amount of habitat loss. And so there may not be any sites within a few hundred or even 1,000 kilometers that, are still really good the way that they were, say, 50 or 100 years ago. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. So how's it looking generally then? Like, in terms of the progress that we're making in relation to shorebirds, is it good news, or like do we still have lots of work to do, or does it depend on the species, or?
Yes to everything. So I think there has been some really good news. There has been a particular focus, I would say, over the last couple of years on the Yellow Sea region. So the Yellow Sea encompasses parts of the coast of China as well as North Korea and South Korea, and kind of goes in a shape like this. And that region has become really well known as a migratory bottleneck, and also a place that has had a lot of habitat loss. And there's been a really incredible conservation effort and some really, really positive things happening there. Serial World Heritage nominations for tidal flats in both China and Republic of Korea. So some really, really big steps towards conservation there. But as you mentioned, shorebirds aren't one thing. It's actually, we're talking about 50 different species, at least, if we're talking about migratory shorebirds in our region, probably more like 60. And so some species are more dependent on the Yellow Sea, and some species are more dependent on other places. So I think there's still a lot of knowledge gaps, and there's still a lot of work to be done in other places. There's also a lot of work to be done. This is something I've kind of turned my attention to lately, is it's not just about extent, it's also about quality. So the first thing we want to do is not lose all of our tidal flats. We don't want to have buildings built on top of all of our tidal flats. But once we get that far, I think our job's not finished. There's kind of increasing evidence that there's lots of other pressures still on those remaining tidal flats, things going on with the dynamics of the little invertebrates that the shorebirds are eating, or encroachment from invasive grasses is actually spreading across the mudflats and drying them out, which again makes them have a lot less food for the birds, and all sorts of other pressures. So I think we still have a lot of work to do, both on extent, although we're improving, I would say. Generally, there's a positive trajectory there, at least certainly in the Yellow Sea in that category. But I think there's a lot more work to do on habitat quality. And I think there's also a lot more conservation work to be done in Southeast Asia, which hasn't been as much of a focus, I would say, as the Yellow Sea for conservation efforts over the last 10 years, at least not amongst the kind of international community.
This is all really interesting. Also, again, through the birding lens, the birding as a hobby, because so this is interesting, and I always like to ask this. So you spend your life working on birds and researching them. So how do you distinguish between between the, your passion for birding in the proper sense of birding and your research? Like, do you sometimes struggle to distinguish between those two things? Like, I want to go birding, I've got a day off, I just want to go. And are you big into eBird, by the way? Yeah.
Yes, I am.
So how do you, because it must be really difficult. Well, I don't know if difficult's the right word, but interesting to combine the two things, right? Your research work, which is work, it's hard work, and then also the leisure of birding. So how do you balance the work and the birding?
Yeah, I mean, not always perfectly, probably. I think I genuinely know people who birds seem to be their whole life. That is kind of what they do, no matter what time of day, no matter where they are. For me, I have another huge passion in my life, which is music. I play a lot of music, and I love going to live music. So genuinely for me, sometimes I do need a break from the whole thing. I think because I have a very hard time going birding and separating that from conservation concern. So I think some people are much better at that than I am. Sometimes I have a really hard time kind of ever just enjoying it without worrying about the birds, without worrying about that environment. And so that can have that thing in your back of the head where you're just always on, you're always worried, you're always anxious, some part of you. So for me, music is kind of a real release from that. So that's one way that I cope with it. I think the other thing that's probably not that balanced in my life is, I mean, I do like being nomadic, and that's great. And because I don't have kids, I don't have a house, I don't even have a car. So I tend to move around to follow amazing work where I can do field work, where I can do amazing research, I can do the collaborations I want to do, but that work tends to be fairly transient. And so, my belongings are all in storage in Adelaide from my last job right now, and I don't really know when I'm gonna have enough clarity about what I'm doing to take them out again. And I don't think that's for me, it's not a huge worry, and I sort of love it, but it has downsides sometimes, definitely too. So.
Wow, that's a very, very unique position you're in a way, isn't it? Because you get to see these places, and of course the birds that go with the places, like we were talking about at the beginning, which is that the birds identify a place or give the place a soul, in a sense. And then part of that research is eBird that I alluded to earlier. So do you use eBird in your research, or is it mostly for your personal records?
Yeah, I'm starting to. I think so I'm a massive eBird fan. Both because I enjoy using it as far as like the personal user experience I really like, but also because I think it has just huge potential to contribute to bird conservation. And I'm only just sticking my toe in the water and taking some initial stabs at that now. But I think every day there's increasing capacity to analyze big data in really, really mind-blowing new ways. And there's more and more evidence also coming out to suggest that citizen science is useful for answering so many more research questions than we previously thought. And part of that is all about this ability to analyze big data and to use machine learning techniques and things like this, which weren't possible even in the recent past. And so I guess for me too, because I've interacted with a little bit with some of the team at Cornell, I think that they are in general just fabulous and very collegial and collaborative with this incredible resource that they've developed, which I think is another huge plus. So I don't know, for me, I'm not a very good patch birder, or at least I certainly wasn't, and eBird gets me, like I feel like I am doing something useful, but I also love making lists, and eBird makes making lists so much easier.
Exactly. And I think you alluded to this earlier in our conversation. Let me remember when you said, that some birders don't have a regard for conservation, but what eBird has done and what the Cornell guys have done is tap into those birders and use their data for conservation.
Oh, that's interesting.
Right?
I never thought of that. Yeah, sure.
It's just come to me because
And don't get me wrong, I mean, I think probably most birders are interested in bird conservation, but it's not everyone, definitely. I definitely know some birders, and I'm guilty of this sometimes too, who like don't take any pleasure anymore in common birds. Like the whole aim of birding is to find new birds and to find the bird that no one else found. And even like within your local patch, oh, no one's ever seen this bird here. And so that's the goal, that's the goal, that's the goal. And we forget, not accusing other people of doing it. I do it all the time. We forget to just go, hang on, I just actually love birds, and let's just stop and appreciate this bird that's here right now. It doesn't matter that you can see it every single day. It's still amazing and brings me joy to look at it. And so I do think there probably is a trade-off that people are better and less good at managing in terms of when you use a resource like eBird or any other kind of data collection, it can have that tendency to make you just never switch off and never just enjoy it and never not just have a goal, or I need the list to be complete, or is there 5 birds here or 6? I think it can take away from the enjoyment if you're not careful, if you don't manage it, if you don't manage to kind of take a step back sometimes. And I'm probably guilty of that sometimes too. And any bird, it can fuel you in that direction sometimes. You just want to see your numbers tick up, for the year. one more. And it's like, no, never mind the birds you haven't seen. Stop and look at the bird that's right in front of you doing something really cool.
No, yeah, definitely. That's right. And it's that balance, isn't it? Because we get pleasure from that side as well. Like, and birders are varied because human beings are varied, and there's different birders everywhere. And it goes into another question that we had prepared, which I really like this question, and I'm interested in, the different takes on it. Is what makes a good birder?
Yeah, I think I'm a bad person to ask because I don't think I'm a good birder at all. But I think I'd say 2 things. What I admire most in people that I would say this is a cracking good birder is people who are good at bird calls. I think, you miss more than half the birds available to you on any given block around the block if you can't identify birds by their calls. So I'm trying to get better at that, but it just always, like, I just instantly know when I go out with someone who's a much better birder than me because they've already seen 10 things, which actually they just heard, and I, only picked up on 2 of them or something. But I think, so that's kind of that makes an amazing, there's lots of things that make people really, cracking hot birders, but personally, my favorite birders are kind of the ones that take the most joy out of going birding, who appreciate that it is a huge privilege to be able to safely go out with your binoculars around your neck and go birding and not feel threatened, or that whole aspect, that you have the time to do it, that you have the safe environment to do it, that you can enjoy it, because I know people in countries where birding is not a safe activity, and they still are so passionate about it that they go out and do it every day.
Wow. Where, for example?
I mean, lots of places. And I mean, even there's even been times, like, there's parts of Toronto that have cool birds that you need to go see at nighttime that I have totally not felt safe going to look for. I think, places, lots of places.
Australia is very, very blessed in that, isn't it? The security that you have around the country, really.
Absolutely.
The only
such a privilege.
The only danger I was going to say is not human sourced, but it's when, for example, when you're in the outback and you get lost, for example. That's happened.
Sure.
Like stuff like that, and also like with the dangerous animals, which is a little bit of a stereotype from overseas, but there is some truth to it. Like, people, and you would know, you would have experienced this, right? Like, Australia, everything kills you in Australia, but do you know what I mean? It's like,
absolutely,
that's where you get the that
but
side
I think
of danger.
in a lot of other countries, the danger of driving to your birding site is much, much, much higher than any danger you'd experience from wildlife in Australia.
Oh, wow.
I mean, even just how safe the roads are here, and how little traffic there is to get to most places, and how clean the air is when you get outside and go birding. I mean, these are all huge areas of privilege, and I think I really appreciate birders who have a sense of that that who know how lucky they are to be able to go birding.
Yeah. So gratitude in a word. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Just appreciation and awareness. And of course, I mean, I love seeing when people translate their birding into bird conservation, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, and other things as well, like into art, like for photography or illustrations, or even music. A lot of music is there's a great book by Tim Lowe, Where Song Began, and that's focused on the sounds and the music, and how it's there's so many different layers to it, because birds are so visible. They've been with humans forever.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's funny because I think that book is very much about bird song and looking at bird song and its relation to evolution, where birds radiated from, and all this sort of thing. But there's also, amazing people who, again, like may not be what we would consider hardcore birders, but who translate love and appreciation of birds into human music. And one of my favorite examples for World Migratory Bird Day during COVID, when people couldn't get together, the East Asian Australasian Flyway Partnership and a group called the Bowerbird Collective from here in Australia, they did this amazing collaboration where they got people from all different countries in the Flyway to sing at the same time on Zoom, and they made this massive like choir, and there was like bird sounds in the songs and stuff like that, and it was just amazing. I mean, what an amazing idea. And again, like people who would never go on Zoom and sing for public, of course, when you tell them it's for World Migratory Bird Day, they're like, yes, sign me up, that sounds really cool. So yeah, I think there's an amazing intersection that, I mean, maybe scientists are not so good at finding and appreciating, but there's a lot of artists coming into our space lately. Like I've been at quite a few conferences the last few years where they'll feature an art exhibition, or where we'll actually have a talk from someone who curates art that's about birds, who isn't a bird researcher at all, but who's interested. Again, it's that thing of being interested in bird conservation. There's been this amazing traveling exhibit called the Overwintering Project, where artists from all over Australia and New Zealand have contributed, and even further have contributed these amazing like prints and things to this sort of traveling exhibition that's all about shorebirds and shorebird conservation. And a lot of those people are not birders, but they love the shorebird story, and they've done an amazing thing for shorebird conservation. So yeah, I think art and music are an amazing way to kind of just cultivate that passion in people, and that appreciation of birds in people.
Yeah, because people respond visually, don't they? And what's the word? Through audio. And you have a lot of that, not only in birding but in the whole natural world. Like it's there's so many ways to communicate that, and what it boils down to in this part of the episode is narrowing it down to species level, right? So what would you say is your favorite bird species?
Well, I have to pick a shorebird. I think my favorite bird's probably sanderling. Sanderling's a really widespread shorebird. It's one of those birds I remember from my childhood in Florida. It's probably the one that little Pixar animation space. It's the one that you see always running right at the edge of the wave. They have this really interesting feeding strategy where they follow waves, and I think people find them really funny because they're this really quick running, and then like the wave will come, and sometimes they even get swamped by the wave, and then they kind of look really, how did that happen? And then running, like, always busy. And I think they're so cute. And I think they're a nice one because they're widespread. They're not super threatened. They're not super rare. They're just an amazing bird that I know has made people smile all over the world. Yeah.
Great choice. Great bird. Yeah, that's a first for the show. Yeah, definitely. Sanderling. And in the same vein, do you have a dream bird you haven't seen yet that you'd love to add to your list?
So many. Okay. This is a very hard to narrow down. Let's say I'll pick two shorebirds, and I'll even pick two non-coastal shorebirds. I think one would be cream-colored corsair because they are just stunning. Yeah. I love the desert, and the idea of shorebirds in the desert so fun. And I think there's at least a small chance you could see them in Algeria, which is somewhere I've never been that I've always wanted to go to. But maybe the other one, which is more realistic, is small Pratt and Cole. It is so cute and so cool. They're ridiculously, insanely awesome. And I've never been to India either, so good excuse to go to India. Yes.
Oh, fabulous. Good choices. And and I guess that ties into what you just said about India and Algeria. But what's if you had, this is the way I'm formulating it lately, is if you had 2 weeks of completely free time and unlimited expenses to go birding, where would you go?
Well, I am a sucker for bulk, so I probably would start in Colombia. More bird species than anywhere else in the world. There was a conference there for the society that I'm involved with a few years ago, and I couldn't go because I was doing my fieldwork in China, and I'm still devastated that I missed out on that trip.
Yeah.
And I think in 2 weeks with unlimited expenses, there's some other really special place, like I think Costa Rica and Yucatan Peninsula, where I actually have relatives who live and I haven't been there yet. That's really, really high. I think if I could hit all three of those places in 2 weeks, they're not that far apart. Wow. That would tick a lot of boxes for me.
Of course. Oh, and the Americas, they're amazing for birds, like everywhere's amazing. Would you, if I was to ask you the same question but only in Australia, is there a spot in Australia or an Australian bird that you'd love to see?
Sit on a painted snipe spot near Canberra and not move until I saw one. I would just get people to bring me really nice food and, I don't know, some cases of beer while I sat there until I saw it. It's my biggest bogey bird in Australia. I think it's stunning.
Yeah. Well, they're not that easy. Like it's not everyone has that one. Yeah. I mean, there's always more to see, which is another source of joy in birding, isn't there? But well, that's that more or less concludes our episode, Micha. So it's been really, really great to have you. Anything else you want to add?
No, that was really fun. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's fun just to kind of have a yak about birds and not be having to make a presentation. And it's a really lovely invitation. Hopefully it's enjoyable for the listeners, but it's also a really lovely experience for me to just reflect on some of this stuff. So thank you for the opportunity.
Absolutely, my sincere pleasure. So keep in touch, and thanks for coming on. Thank you, Micha.
Thanks a lot. See ya.
Bye.